I'm in big trouble. Those were the first words of experienced hiker Stephen Olshansky when he was caught in a sudden snowstorm. He never imagined he would become the central figure in one of the most chilling survival stories in the world of hiking. Stephen would soon find out how long a person can survive trapped inside a locked forest outhouse, buried in snow, with nothing to eat but horse oats, clinging only to faith and a miracle. Hiking always tests its followers. But what kind of trials does it truly hide? How often do you go on long hikes yourself? And how far do you usually walk? Veteran hikers would surprise you with their answers. For example, the Continental Divide Trail stretches nearly 3,000 miles. Even the most experienced thru hikers need around 5 months to complete it. But in 2015, Stephen Olshansky, known among hikers as Otter, planned to tackle just 75 miles of that trail. For him, with his experience and preparation, it was supposed to be a casual walk. He carried only a small tent and a portable stove. His route from Cumbers Pass, New Mexico, to Ghost Ranch, a section known for its rugged terrain, steep cliffs, and dangerous stretches. Otter knew very well that starting in mid-November was risky. By then, the weather turned brutal. Usually, the last brave hikers set out no later than August. Forecasts already warned of heavy snow. But he went anyway. A friend dropped him off at the trailhead. They agreed Stephen would check in from the finish line in about 2 weeks. But news of him came much later. Almost immediately, Otter felt weak. He thought he had the flu. In his journal, he wrote about the symptoms but kept pushing forward. 3 days later, everything changed. On the night of November 17th, a powerful storm hit the mountains, dumping over a foot of snow. For local snowmobile tour operators, it was perfect. For Otter, it was a nightmare. His light clothing and footwear couldn't handle the cold. The next day, sick and freezing, he managed less than a mile. His goal had been 7. Exhausted, he turned back to his last campsite. That's when reality hit. Things were getting critical. Another problem, no communication. He couldn't afford a satellite emergency beacon. His phone only worked as a camera. And just a few friends even knew his route. Otter was left with hope alone. But no miracle came. Instead, frostbite crept into his toes. Days later, another blizzard rolled in. Snow fell nonstop for a week. Desperate, he used the only tool he had. He stomped a giant "help" sign into the snow, praying a rescue helicopter might see it. But the days passed. No rescuers came. His food supply was vanishing. 17 days into the ordeal, Stephen made one of the biggest decisions of his life. He would move. He remembered a campground nearby Lagunitas, where there was a small outhouse that could offer shelter. With no map, guided only by memory and instinct, he set off in what might have been his last chance. Stephen was an experienced outdoorsman, but his strength was fading fast. He had nearly accepted the idea of collapsing in the forest when he suddenly stumbled upon an outhouse. That discovery saved his life. He crawled inside, slipped into his sleeping bag, lit his tiny stove, and even managed to make a cup of hot tea. Meanwhile, his friend grew worried. Otter never called. Soon it became clear he hadn't reached Ghost Ranch. Search efforts began, but rescuers faced immediate problems. High winds and blizzards made it almost impossible to see from the air. Helicopters circled the area in vain. Trapped for 27 days, Stephen nearly lost all hope. Finally, he decided to act. Near the outhouse, he found a shed and some metal sheets. With them, he built makeshift skis. Before leaving, he set the shed on fire, hoping the smoke would guide rescuers. But moving through deep snow was brutal. He fell constantly, draining what little energy and warmth he had left. Then he heard a sound he had been waiting for, a search plane. Stephen staggered into the open, waving and shouting. The plane passed right over him. He was sure rescue had come, but because of the rugged terrain and heavy winds, the pilots never saw him. Barely alive, he crawled back to the cramped outhouse, so small he could only lie down diagonally. Before burning the shed, he had found a sack of horse oats. He crushed the grain with rocks and boiled it into a rough porridge. That meager food kept him alive for several more weeks. But his hope was fading. In his journal, He began to write that he was preparing for death. Planes kept flying overhead, but rescuers were misled by a false report that someone had seen him more than 100 miles away. His friends begged search teams to try snowmobiles, but no one contacted a local tour operator who was less than half a day away from Stephen's real location. Inside the tiny outhouse, he was slowly fading, recording his final thoughts. In unbearable pain, with no strength left, he decided to eat one last meal of porridge, light his stove, and end it by breathing in the smoke. But the plan failed. The shack wasn't airtight. The smoke escaped. From then on, he stopped fighting. His thoughts narrowed to two things: eating and waiting for the end. January arrived with new storms. Otter kept writing about pain, fear, failed attempts to end it, and faint flickers of hope. Another month passed. By February 2016, he was still alive. But the oats were gone. Too weak to even melt snow for water, he lay motionless on the outhouse floor, slowly being buried under drifting snow. On May 10th, another hiker, Jan Cromvey, arrived at the Lagunitas campground. He first noticed the burned shed, then a note pinned to the outhouse door. It said a dead man was inside. The message ended, "This is not a joke." Shocked, Cromvey stopped his hike immediately and called the police. Inside the tiny outhouse, they found the body of Stephen Olshansky, an experienced hiker who had lost his fight with the elements. He had skill. He had preparation. But this time, nature proved stronger than man. And it leaves one haunting question. If a hardened outdoorsman couldn't survive, what chance do ordinary hikers have? The story of Geraldine Largay. Geraldine was 66 years old. A former U.S. Air Force nurse, trained and experienced, she set herself a bold goal: to hike the legendary Appalachian Trail, over 2,000 miles long. In the summer of 2013, she planned to cover about half the trail. From Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, all the way north to the trail's end in Maine. She began the journey with a friend. Along the way, her husband would meet them, bringing food and supplies. Everything went smoothly until June 30th, when her friend had to leave the hike. From that day, Geraldine walked alone. For nearly a month, she made steady progress. She met other hikers, stayed in touch with her husband at agreed checkpoints. But on July 22nd, everything changed. That morning, she left the Poplar Ridge shelter. Her goal: 13 miles to meet her husband. Before heading out, she asked another hiker to take her photo. In it, she is smiling, full of energy. That photo became the last ever taken of her. On the trail, Geraldine stepped off briefly to relieve herself. When she returned, she couldn't find the path. At first, she didn't believe she was lost. She pushed on, thinking she was heading the right way. At 11:01 a.m., she sent her husband a text: "I'm lost. Please call the wardens." But there was no signal. The message never went through. She tried again and again. None were delivered. When she failed to show up at the meeting point, her husband reported her missing. Search crews acted quickly. They gathered reports from other hikers. They pinpointed where she had last been seen, and the hunt began. Meanwhile, Geraldine was alone in the wilderness. She climbed ridges, desperate for cell service. Nothing. She set up her tent beneath fallen trees to shield herself from the rain. But the cover also hid her from rescue planes. Dogs lost her scent in the bad weather. Days passed. She began keeping a journal. But unlike Stephen Olshansky, she had run out of food the very day she disappeared. Her husband had been bringing supplies. Each day, she grew weaker. In time, she accepted the reality of death. On August 6th, 2 weeks after vanishing, she wrote one last text to her husband. Then, she left a final note. In it, she begged whoever found her body to notify her family and to deliver her journal to them. Her final entry was dated August 18th. She remained missing for more than 2 years. Finally, in October 2015, Lieutenant Kevin Adam of the Navy received word. Human remains had been found on a military training ground, not far from the Appalachian Trail. He immediately thought of a missing hiker, Geraldine Largay. When the search team finally reached the site, there was no doubt. It was Geraldine's camp. Inside the tent, they found her body. She had wandered only 2 miles off the Appalachian Trail, but that short distance placed her inside a Navy training ground, an area the rescuers never searched because it belonged to the military. The most tragic part, at least 3 search teams had passed within just 90 yards of her shelter. Yet no one saw it. Geraldine died from exhaustion and starvation 26 days after she got lost. Her story became another painful reminder of how the mix of harsh nature and human mistakes can turn fatal. And sometimes, there are cases where hikers are left with no chance at all against the forces of nature. The tragedy at Antelope Canyon. In August 1997, a group of tourists set out on an excursion to the famous Antelope Canyon. Their guide was Pancho Quintana. The journey had started in Denver, leading them to Lake Powell. From there, they decided on a side trip to the canyon. On August 12th, 12 people, including Pancho, purchased their entry tickets and descended into the lower section of the Slot Canyon. At first, the route seemed harmless. Just a narrow crack in the earth, a staircase leading steeply down. Even then, 6 people felt the grip of claustrophobia. They chose to stay behind at the top. The rest pressed on, stopping to take pictures of the canyon's breathtaking shapes and curves. None of them realized that just a few miles away, a desert storm was beginning. Rain poured down in sheets, turning sand into rushing torrents. At first, the water spilled into Lake Powell. Minutes later, it thundered into Antelope Canyon. The tourists had no warning until Pancho felt the ground trembling. He shouted for everyone to run toward the ladder. It was only 100 feet away, but not nearly enough. A wall of red-brown water slammed into them, thick and heavy like liquid clay. It roared with the sound of jet engines. Pancho was swept off his feet. By instinct, he grabbed onto the canyon wall. The water rose to his chest. Nearby, he saw 2 tourists. With every ounce of strength, he tried to pull them up. They were close, so close, when the current brought more bodies crashing into them. The force ripped everyone apart. The last thing Pancho saw of his group was a blur of faces swallowed by the flood. Then a wave of mud and debris smothered him, dragging him under. He later said it felt like being trapped inside a giant washing machine filled with sandpaper. The water slammed him against the walls. Branches and rocks shredded his skin. Every time he surfaced, he thought it might be his last breath. Finally, the flood spat him out more than a quarter-mile downstream. Broken, bruised, barely alive, but alive. No one else was there. Rescuers later found 9 bodies, some swept nearly 4 miles down the canyon. 2 more were never recovered. For years, Pancho struggled with the guilt of being the only survivor. He returned to the canyon again and again, haunted, blaming himself. It took 16 years before he could accept the truth that on that day, fate had been sealed by the power of nature. But some stories can't be explained, even by natural disasters. The disappearance of Randy Morgenson. In 1996, Randy Morgenson was serving his 28th season as a backcountry ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in California. Among his colleagues, he was considered the best. A man who knew the land almost by heart. Over 3,000 square kilometers of mountains, forests, glacial lakes, and caves were his second home. But that year, Randy was a broken man. His wife had filed for divorce after learning about his affair with a coworker. He tried leaning on his friends for support, but instead sank deeper into depression. On July 20th, he radioed 2 of his fellow rangers. It seemed like an ordinary conversation until it ended with strange words that he would not bother them again. After that silence, at his campsite, a note was found. It said he had left and would return in 2 or 3 days. His firearm was left behind at a ranger station near Bench Lake. On July 25th, Randy was declared missing. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue missions in the park's history. The search zone covered 80 square miles. Rain washed away every trace. Hundreds of rescuers joined. Dogs, helicopters with infrared scanners. All they found was a small fire pit on a hillside. Theories spread quickly. Some believed Randy had taken his own life. Others suspected murder. He had received threats before. But every suspect had an alibi. 13 days later, the search was called off. No footprints. No body. Nothing. It wasn't until 2001, 5 years later, that a resource officer stumbled upon Randy's belongings and remains. They were found 4 miles from Bench Lake, near a creek below Window Peak. A torn shirt with a ranger badge. His backpack. A boot with bones still inside. Evidence suggested he may have broken his leg, fallen into the creek, and gone unnoticed for years. But the mystery didn't end there. Later, near a waterfall, rangers discovered one of his backcountry stations. A station that hadn't been there during the original search. This raised chilling questions. Had his body and belongings been moved after the fact? The case grew even murkier. And the death of Randy Morgenson remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American hiking history. Because in the mountains, you never truly know what awaits. Even on a well-worn trail. Even with the people walking beside you. One respected Appalachian Trail guide, known as Bismarck, turned out to be one of America's most dangerous criminals. So remember this. In the world of hiking, carelessness is never forgiven.